Before I get started with this episode, I want to let you know that it covers the topics of filicide, infanticide, and racism, as well as a brief mention of sexual abuse and the discussion of alleged sexual assault of an inmate by prison employees. These alleged sexual assaults are, in my opinion, a contrived story, so there's that extra layer of ick. I'm reviewing the Susan Smith case from episode 21 and talking about her behavior behind bars since her conviction. This won't be a graphic episode, but the case is intense. So if this one isn't for you, please take care of yourself first. And I'll see you next time. It's fine. Also, this is not an episode for the little ones. And so, here we go. Hold on. Hi, this is Carla, and welcome back to There Might Be Cupcakes. I apologize for the unintended long hiatus. It really bothers me. I hate when life and health get in the way of talking to you and telling stories to you and writing and all of it. It's been a doozy of a holiday season and a new year, and my plans went out the window. Just as John Lennon said, life is what happens when you're making other plans. To be transparent and honest about mental health, I struggled with the holidays this year. It was 1 year since losing my partner in crime, Ellie the Dachshund. And I haven't really talked about this, but her loss could have been prevented. I won't dwell on it here, but I spent most of last year reporting her vet to the Commonwealth of Virginia for maltreatment. So I don't think I've had the time and space to grieve because of all the bureaucracy and the paperwork and all of the phone interviews where I retold the story of her last day over and over and over. So I had to check out emotionally to do all of that work in her honor, to do all that for her. Then the holidays hit. That's when she died. And I just didn't feel my celebratory self. But I tried nevertheless, and well, I just can't push through stuff like healthy people can. I try, but my immune system laughs, and everything gets inflamed, and the fatigue slaps me around. So I was humbled and forced to rest and grieve my very best girl. Then on New Year's Day, which I had planned all this start-over stuff for, not too much, very reasonable for my health. I had podcast plans and personal plans and David Bowie's Moon Age Daydream queued up for the very first thing to watch to start off the new year right. And my mother-in-law wrecked her car. We received the call during Bowie from the hospital. Off we go. The summary is that her car was totaled and she won't ever be driving again. And she was miraculously unhurt. So all of January was dealing with her insurance and her rental car and her new car, which was our rental car and our new car for toting her around, and dealing with the DMV switching over her license to an ID. And all that stress translates to flare-up after flare-up because my immune system freaked out and went into emergency mode. Then I got sick. Extra sick is what I call it, when I contract something beyond my daily chronic illnesses. I will spare you the gory details beyond it involving antibiotics. And the fact that I'm allergic to penicillin and minocycline, the usual heavy hitters, so I have to take the also-rans with scary side effects that knock me out. The most recent one had an entry on both drugs.com and the Mayo Clinic site that basically just says, please don't take this drug. The main side effect is torn tendons. Yeah. That's the first time you're hearing this, Mom. Sorry. I didn't want to worry you. What the actual torn tendons? Luckily, my tendons are fine, other than just hurting, as they usually do. Also, my immune system sometimes fights antibiotics as if they were the true intruders. So, you get the picture. There's that. Down for the extra count. I feel like 2023 has been like this. Whoosh. Oh, look, my birthday. Whoosh. What do you mean it's March? I have to do another Christmas episode. Wait a minute. It's March. I can't. With all the above that's happened, I feel like my body is in March and my head is somewhere back in the holiday season. I'm really dizzy. So, that's where I've been. How are y'all? You okay? I'm not having fun and not podcasting. So if I ever go on hiatus again, please know that I would rather be podcasting. I'm probably too fatigued to sleep, listening to an audiobook, staring at the ceiling, and berating myself for not writing and not podcasting, counting the days since my last episode, last Patreon activity, and last Substack email, which all makes my health worse. Lovely vicious circle. Enough about me. Consider that all one long apology as well as an update, and let's just stop there. This episode is part of reviewing and celebrating the first 5 years of my podcast by going back to one of my favorite episodes, number 21, 9 Days in 2 Car Seats, in which I examined a local crime to me, Susan Smith's murdering of her 2 sons, Alexander and Michael Smith. It's one of my favorites because I'm quite proud of it, and because I lived through it as a local, and doing so was obscenely harrowing. So exploring it was cathartic. She said, I care about kids. She said, I care about yours. That's a fellow inmate of Susan Smith describing something she heard Susan say to her girlfriend during an argument. If that gives you any idea about what we're going to explore. Yeah, no remorse. If you're not familiar with the case, on October 25th, 1994, Susan drove/pushed her car off the ramp into John D. Long Lake in Union, South Carolina. She was not in the vehicle, but her 2 young boys were, strapped into their car seats in the back seat. She then pretended for 9 days that a mysterious black man, one of the most infamous instances of the, quote, shaggy-haired stranger story, carjacked her and kidnapped the children, devastating her estranged husband David and the entire town and area. I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina at the time. As I explained in the episode, this was also an infamous example of what is known as a racial hoax. For those of you who have not heard the episode, I've attached it to this one, and you can listen to it following. I apologize for that clicking noise. That is my producer, Arlo the Stabby Pit. He paces sometimes when I podcast, and I've just learned to live with it. He's taking care of me, checking the perimeter, all that stuff. Thank you, Arlo. Lay down, sweetheart. I love you too. As I explained in the episode, this was also an infamous example of what is known as a racial hoax. For those of you who have not heard the episode, I've attached it to this one, and you can listen to it following. The title of that episode, 9 Days in 2 Car Seats, comes from Susan's admission to the sheriff that she knew the whereabouts of Michael and Alex 9 days later, which he repeated in his nationally broadcast press conference. That episode, episode 21, will repeat, as I said, in its entirety after this one, if you hang on. For patrons, I've also included its script at the end of this episode's script, so you can just keep reading. Smith was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She's eligible for parole starting November 4th, 2024, according to the South Carolina Department of Corrections. So I will probably revisit this case at that time, because the experience of being a local during those 9 days and during the trial still haunts me. Those little boys' pictures were in every post office and grocery store in Charlotte. And the news covered it every morning, every evening, every lunchtime. It was awful. Smith is housed at Leith Correctional in Greenwood, South Carolina, and that is part of her sordid catch-up story. So here we go. Some people's lives are ground in deception. For Susan Smith, maintaining the image of the model daughter, friend, wife, and mother was an arduous, lifelong task, and in the end, it collapsed. Maria Efedeme's Sins of the Mother. I would add to that perfect inmate and perfect victim. Before I discuss her behavior as an inmate, I want to talk about her father's suicide when she was 6 years old. Harry Vaughn shot himself in the stomach, then immediately called for help. I wondered, from my earlier training in suicidology as a therapist, if this was rather an attempt to draw attention to his emotional pain and possibly reconcile with his wife, since it occurred 38 days after his divorce from her mother was finalized. This also makes me wonder about Susan's later suicide attempts. Did they have the same motive? In both, she used aspirin tablets. Not an exceptionally lethal method. And it also makes me wonder if the boy's murder was a macabre and violent cry for help and attention, mimicking what she saw in childhood. In the second suicide attempt, at age 18, she was hospitalized from November 7th to November 15th, 1989, missing work at the grocery store, and it worked to garner attention. She got David Smith's attention, her future husband and the boy's future father. They married March 15th. So, by 19, she had suffered the suicide of her father, twice attempted to kill herself, had been sexually molested, and stumbled on her father-in-law near death by his own hand and saved him. By 20, she was a mother. Sins of the mother. All this means is that Susan learned to be the center of attention, specifically chaotic and painful attention, usually at someone else's expense and pain. At age 23, she would have the attention of the entire country, at the expense of 2 young lives, her family's broken hearts, and the pain and security of the local African American community. The short timeline that will take us to Susan in prison and the havoc she had wrought in there. Michael Daniel Smith was born October 10, 1991. Susan was 20. Alexander Tyler Smith was born August 5, 1993. Susan was 22. September 21, 1994. Susan served David with divorce papers on grounds of adultery. She had sole custody with 48 hours notice for visitation for David, so she had full control. Susan turned 23 5 days later. Note, Susan was also adulterous. October 17, 1994, Susan's boss's son, whom she was dating, wrote her a Dear Jane letter. One of his many reasons for breaking up with her was that he did not want children. She then showed up at his office, physical demeanor completely askew, his letter in hand, and had, for lack of a better phrase, a public freakout. She had to be escorted out by security. That's how bad it was. This display included a panicked recitation of all of her other affairs and sexual partners in a desperate effort to seem desirable and lovable to this man. This litany included Beverly Russell, her stepfather, who had started molesting her as a teen. She was still having sex with him, and yes, he was still married to her mother. Given their power differential, it's dicey to say whether or not this was a true sexual relationship, of course. Rather than be intrigued by her desirability, her now ex-boyfriend was duly horrified. October 25th, 1994, 1 month and 4 days after the divorce filing, and 8 days after the letter. Susan pushed the car into John D. Long Lake with the boys strapped into their car seats inside, and began the 9 days racial hoax, claiming a black man had carjacked her at a stoplight. Details from the police report. Susan Vaughn Smith, 23, 5'3", 130 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes. Michael Daniel Smith, 3 feet, 30 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes. Alexander Tyler Smith, 1, 2'4", 25 pounds, blonde hair, brown eyes. Susan was wearing an Auburn University sweatshirt, which was the alma mater of her work ex-boyfriend. His breakup Dear Jane letter would be found in the submerged car.
I want to say to my baby that your mama loves you so much.
Susan, it seemed, never spent a moment alone. Always friends and family surrounded her. It was an odd change. The loneliness of her past was suddenly replaced by absolute love and support. Perhaps the horror of what she did was somehow muted in this atmosphere of sympathy and caring. Since the mother. I'm reminded of a moment on the reality show The Real Housewives of Orange County, when Vicki Gunvalson admits to being complicit in her boyfriend's pretending to have cancer, and states that the reason was, for the most part, she wanted her friends to bring over casseroles. As a chronically ill person, I'm really sickened by people that pretend to be ill. She let her friends think that someone they knew was going to die a slow death so she could have the ritual of visits and casseroles. Casseroles! And she said it so calmly, just like, well, of course, casseroles. Why wouldn't I? It chills me typing that out for the script and now saying it to you guys. To think that there's a good chance that Susan thought that out. The family love, the community surrounding her, the news, the wider community praying and sending cards and good wishes. The casseroles. She even went right before she confessed to the sheriff, when he was pushing her, right before she said the children are not all right. She turned on the little girl voice and asked the sheriff, who she'd known since childhood, "Will you pray with me?" Attention. Casseroles. So now we skip ahead to after Smith's trial. On July 28, 1995, she was sentenced to life and sent to the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, a women's prison, and placed in the administrative segregation unit for her own safety, given her crimes. However, she did not so much want to be in Columbia, because her ever-supportive and wealthy mother and her mother's bank account were too far away, near Leithwood Correctional Institution for Women in Greenwood County. She put in for a transfer to Leithwood, and it was denied. Remember how I said she was in Leithwood now? Yeah. Susan hurt people again to get what she wants. And what she wanted this time was more visits and gifts for her mother. So, Susan met Alfred Rowe, Jr., the captain of security at Camille Graham. He started working there in 1998 after 10 years of service in men's prison as the captain. She was sentenced to life on July 28, 1995. To Graham, she met him on his first night. She told him she had remorse, though never why she did it. No details, just, "I'm sorry." She would help him do his job by informing on other inmates for infractions of the rules, like possessing drugs. You know, snitches are not well liked in prison. She kept him company during long and boring night shifts. Then one night, she passed him a note, like a teenager, that said, and I quote, "I think I like you." In September of 2000, she was supposed to be cleaning up the gym after an event for the inmates. And she followed Rowe into the athletic director's office where he was supervising her. And she said, quote, "I think I want to give you a blowjob. Will you let me?" She was 29 years old. He let her, forgetting himself in the moment and forgetting that sex between a corrections officer and an inmate in the state of South Carolina, even if it's consensual, is a felony because of the power differential. It also requires the corrections officer to register as a sex offender and may cost that officer up to 10 years in prison. In 2000, She was treated for a sexually transmitted disease, having found to have sex with 2 prison guards, not just 1. Susan saw an opportunity to get a favor without anyone knowing they were doing her a favor. Albert Rowe. Rowe was fired October 6, 2000, and subsequently pled guilty to the sexual charge, avoiding the prison term. He received 5 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and lifetime registration on the National Sex Offender Registry. She couldn't be around these 2 men who, according to the law and the defined power differential, assaulted her, even though she admittedly seduced them. So she was transferred out of Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia to the only other appropriate women's unit in the state. You guessed it, Leith. Near her mother and her mother's gracious pocketbook. Game, set, match. And 2 men were left in her wake as registered sex offenders, their lives ruined, just as 2 boys had been left in her wake 6 years before. Rowe's sexual offender link is in the show notes and will be linked in this episode's website entry. The statute is linked in his profile, but I'll read it here because it's pertinent to what she did, and I'll bet she looked it up beforehand or asked her attorney or another inmate about it. This is the specific statute for the American state of South Carolina. Your local laws may differ for this particular relationship between prison guard and prisoner. It was instituted due to the high number of cases of actual prisoner rape by prison authorities. Section 4423-1150, sexual misconduct with an inmate, patient, or offender. As used in this section, actor means an employee, volunteer, agent, or contractor of a public entity that has statutory or contractual responsibility for inmates or patients confined in a prison, jail, or mental health facility. Actor includes individuals who supervise inmate labor details outside of an institution or who have supervisory responsibilities for offenders on parole, probation, or other community supervision programs. Victim means an inmate or patient who is confined or lawfully or unlawfully absent from a prison, jail, or mental health facility, or who is offender on parole, probation, or other community supervision programs. A victim is not capable of providing consent for sexual intercourse or sexual contact with the actor. An actor is guilty of sexual misconduct when the actor, knowing that the victim is an inmate, offender, or patient, voluntarily engages with the victim in an act of sexual intercourse, whether vaginal, oral, or anal, or other sexual contact for the purpose of sexual gratification. When the sexual misconduct involves the act of sexual intercourse, whether vaginal, oral, or anal, the actor is guilty of the felony of sexual misconduct, first degree, and upon conviction must be imprisoned for not more than 10 years. When the sexual misconduct does not involve sexual intercourse but involves other sexual contact which is engaged in for sexual gratification, the actor is guilty of the felony of sexual misconduct, second degree, and upon conviction must be imprisoned for not more than 5 years. The term sexual contact, as used in this subsection, refers to the intrusion of any part of a person's body or of any object into the, quote, intimate parts of another person's body, or to the fondling of the intimate parts of another person's body, which is done in a manner not required by professional duties, but instead is done to demonstrate affection, sexually stimulate that person or another person, or harass that person. A person who knowingly or willingly submits inaccurate or untruthful information concerning sexual misconduct, as defined in this section, is guilty of the misdemeanor of falsely reporting sexual misconduct, and upon conviction must be imprisoned for not more than 1 year. A person who has knowledge of sexual misconduct who has received information in the person's professional capacity and fails to report it to the appropriate law enforcement authority, or a person who threatens or attempts to intimidate a witness is guilty of a misdemeanor and, upon conviction, must be fined not more than $500 or imprisoned for not more than 6 months, or both. Susan's defense attorney tried to argue a diagnosis of dependent personality disorder, which is accurate, because someone with DPD would not have been able to carry out complicated, brazen schemes by themselves. The psychiatrist for the prosecution diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, as well as her psychiatrist in prison agreed with that diagnosis, which is much more accurate. To quote forensic psychiatrist Jeffrey McKee from the documentary Murder Made Me Famous, Susan Smith, What Happened? Quote, borderline personality disorder is a severe disabling condition where, out of an intense fear of abandonment, the individual experiences serious disruptions in their mood, in their emotional expression, and in their ability to control their impulses. Now, I want to pause here. There is a new trend of armchair psychiatry online, especially on Reddit and TikTok, where everyone can spot someone who's a narcissist, more correctly stated as someone who has been diagnosed with or who has traits of narcissistic personality disorder, colloquially tossed around as a narc. Ugh, or a borderline, someone diagnosed with or having traits of borderline personality disorder. Don't do this. It's really harmful because we're labeling people we don't know with some of the strongest psychiatric diagnoses. Personality disorders are up there with psychoses because they are intractable to treatment, as of now. Words are powerful. If you haven't studied the DSM as I have, one professor in my postgrad studies made me read the DSM-5 cover to cover. You shouldn't be slinging these diagnostic labels around. They stick, and they can be truly harmful to a person's reputation, to their work, their whole lives, and how they feel about themselves. One way they can be harmful is that people assume that everyone diagnosed with borderline personality disorder is dangerous. This is not true. I know I might have some listeners with this painful diagnosis, and that's a major reason I wanted to pause here. People with this diagnosis are not inherently dangerous. They are struggling to organize their emotions and internal lives, and they are more likely to hurt themselves than other people. I have a lot of empathy for people with this diagnosis. It's a tough life. Before we return to Susan, here's the actual diagnostic criteria for the DSM-5, the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so that we're literally all on the same page. It's defined as, quote, a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image and affects, and marked impulsivity. This fits Susan. Beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by 5 or more of the following, which is how you diagnose something using the DSM. 1. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Think of how she took the letter to her boyfriend's office and had that demonstrative upset where she told him about everybody else she was sleeping with to show how lovable she was. 2. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. You can see this in how David and Susan got together and broke up and got together and separated and got together and broke up and got together and separated and cheated on each other. And, David hung the moon and then David was a creep and so on and so forth. 3. Identity disturbance. Markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. I really see this in her early 20s. I don't think Susan knew who she was really outside of mother and wife. Like, she didn't have hobbies. She didn't really have friends she hung out with. She was the partner of David, the partner of her affairs. The girl who wanted to go out with Tom Finley, the boss's son, and so on and so forth. 4. Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, e.g. spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. Susan is impulsive across the board. 5. Recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures and/or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. 6. Affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. 7. Chronic feelings of emptiness. I think Susan fills this with sexual partners. 8. Inappropriate intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. Again, we can see this simply in her raging in her ex-boyfriend's office. 9. Transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. We might be able to argue this in Alex and Michael's last night. Of her driving around and driving around and driving around, and I was going to go to this friend's house, but no, I wasn't. And the decisions she made that night. And then the 9 days. She seemed out of it. She cried without tears. Her affect was completely strange. She seemed like she wasn't in her body. I remember watching the news. And, David was like a wrung out washcloth and Susan was there. It was very creepy. Added to this diagnostic criteria, like I said, many, if not all, I see in Susan are being, quote, very sensitive to environmental circumstances, experiencing, quote, intense abandonment fears and inappropriate anger even when faced with a realistic time-limited separation or when there are unavoidable changes in plans, aka her mother being 2 hours away instead of right nearby. Quote, they may believe this, quote-unquote, abandonment implies that they are bad. Susan may have interpreted her being placed in this particular women's prison as a comment on her personal worth instead of a need-based placement, i.e., based upon the nature of her crime and therefore the security needed to help keep her safe as a child killer. Also, Camille Graham was near the court in which she was sentenced. This diagnosis is also marked by, quote, sudden and dramatic shifts in self-image characterized by shifting goals, values, and vocational aspirations. Susan's self-esteem can be seen soaring and plummeting throughout her life through her actions, and arguably through her vocational choices. She went from working at a local grocery store to working for the most prestigious employer in the area and dating the boss's son there. Speaking to her repeated self-harm and suicide attempts, her self-harm has continued in prison. The DSM-5 states that, quote, completed suicide occurs 8 to 10% of such individuals, and self-mutilative acts, e.g. cutting and burning, and suicide threats and attempts are very common. Remember, Susan tried to kill herself multiple times with over-the-counter aspirin like Anacin, when much more lethal forms were available. Note, I don't make this statement flippantly at all, but as a former, now disabled therapist who was trained in suicidology. And remember, she claimed the murders were actually a failed suicide attempt, that she jumped out of the car at the last minute, but couldn't save the boys. Yet, she was neither wet nor muddy, nor mussed at all. Quote, these self-destructive acts are usually precipitated by threats of separation or rejection or by expectation that the individual assumes increased responsibility. Remember that I said the boys were murdered October 25th, 1994, 1 month and 4 days after the divorce filing, and 8 days after the Dear Jane letter from her boyfriend. She was going to have to be a single mother, not the wife of David Smith, and not the boyfriend of one of the richest men in town. Increased responsibility every which way she looked. Alex for Michael, for the legal proceedings, for the splitting up of marital assets, for herself. Perhaps if she were a grieving mother with 2 less responsibilities, one of the 2 men, or maybe both, might return to prop her up and comfort her. This might very well have been her reasoning in her emotional pain and panic. Back to her present behaviors. I pulled her inmate search detail report, which contains all of her activity as an inmate in the South Carolina system. It was quite illuminating, especially given this diagnosis. Under the section Disciplinary Actions, she had 3 in 2010, use and possession of drugs twice, and self-mutilation. The penalties were severe, such as telephone loss for an entire year and canteen loss for months, which means only eating in the cafeteria and having no choice of her food. And control is very important to Susan. Given the severity of punishments for these and future disciplinary actions, I'm assuming that she received many, many warnings for the same offenses listed that the authorities didn't bother to list on her record before they finally charged her. In 2012, she was punished for unauthorized use of another inmate's PIN, which is odd, given how much money her mother and fans, don't think about that too long, send her. It must have been a control issue, making this inmate give it up just because it felt good to dominate them and take their money and/or phone time. In 2015, she received another drug charge with equally harsh penalties. One of her fellow inmates said that Susan would take any drug she could get her hands on, and that they'd seen her do any drug any way you can do it, including booty pop, which is what it sounds like. Under movement, her desired transfer to Leith after seducing the two guards at Camille Graham and ruining their lives, I can't say that enough, took place on September 25th, 2000. First, she was placed in protective custody at Graham on September 15th. Then, from April 12th, 2004 to May 20th, 2021, 17 years, she has had 12 medical moves. I assume for self-harm and/or suicide attempts. If any of my listeners work in corrections, could you please let me know if that's excessive, as it seems it is? The section Earned Work Credits takes up 2 pages because she switches jobs more than an irresponsible teenager, both on her own whim and by being moved by administration for behavior. On one job in the canteen, she received a promotion, her only one this whole time, and 2 days later received a demotion. 2 days after that, she asked to be moved elsewhere in the canteen. Impulsive reactions to responsibility. Earned education credits. None. None! From November 4th, 1994 until now, 29 years. More years than she was old when she murdered her sons. Most inmates take classes to at least pass the time, or out of some innate curiosity, or to ingratiate themselves with the parole board. Remember, she becomes eligible for a chance in November of next year. Not Susan! I found this shocking, given how manipulative she is. Under programs, there were only 3 listed, and only 2 of those were completed by her. All 3 were listed as general character-based programs. I take this to mean they were basic stuff, or required as disciplinary reform. This is the section in which group therapy work would be listed, that kind of thing. Again, no work to at least impress parole, and no programs at all since 2019. I apologize if you can hear Toby barking. Yeah, he is guarding the deck from nothing in particular, and the acoustics in this house are weird. So, I'm sorry. Now let's hear from fellow prison inmates. In the documentary Cellmate Secrets, several fellow inmates and former inmates who had befriended her and even been her cellmates at Leith were interviewed. Christy Smith, her cellmate, first met her when she was 20 and Susan was 29. Christy saw psychotic behavior in Susan at times. She said Susan had a photo of her sons in her cell, the famous photo I used for the cover of episode 21, and the same one that was splashed all over the news in the newspapers, and said that Susan would talk to it as if the boys were alive and could hear her. She'd get her morning coffee and then just chat with them, and that it was really uncomfortable. Christy said Susan cut herself on Mother's Day and the anniversary of the murders every year. Stephanie Halsey, a prison mate at Leith, thought they were real suicide attempts, but her cellmate thought they were for attention. Christy said that Susan's wrists are, quote, mutilated with scars. Christy said living with her was difficult because Susan liked control of, quote, her stuff and your stuff, and that she was extremely manipulative. She said Susan used the money she obtained from her mother and fans to manipulate others, including Christy, who obtained drugs for Susan. She said Susan was not particular, like I said, and would do anything she could get, using, quote, drugs as a substitute for male attention. Christy was also used as a lookout for Susan's, quote, sexcapades. She stated that one of Susan's prison girlfriends looked exactly like the fake composite drawing of the racial hoax of the carjacking suspect. Was she reveling in what she had done, or punishing herself, or both? Christy broke ties with Susan when Susan told Christy's son in the visiting room that he could call her Auntie Susan. Christy told her, using expletives, that she killed her sons and therefore could not be affectionate with hers. Susan at that time had a job as a visiting room manager. Can you imagine? What were they thinking? By the way, for those of you curious about prison living, this particular documentary shows you how to make a prison birthday cake and a prison sex toy using a ballpoint pen and a bra. The more you know. So I'll leave you again with what Susan said to one of her prison girlfriends during an argument. And I quote, "I killed my fucking kids. You think I care about yours." I take that as a threat, considering she worked in the visiting room. And that says everything to her claimed remorse to Alfred Rowe. That's not remorse. I can't dig any deeper than I have, so I have to stop here. It's made me angry and sad and second-guessing other people. I need to go watch cartoons and wear a cheerful cardigan or something like that to recoup. Somebody bring me a key lime pie, please. Please. Okay, stay tuned now for a replay of the original episode with my wonderful voice actors. Episode 21, 9 Days and 2 Car Seats. I'm so glad to be back. I'm seeing my neurologist on Monday, so hopefully we'll figure out this uptick in bad flare-ups, and I can be back in podcasting shape for good. Send good vibes on Monday. If you appreciate the podcast, a 5-star rating on Spotify, Audible, the IMDb. Did I mention I'm on the IMDb? Oh. My host Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser is beyond appreciated. You can follow me on Instagram, Reddit, Podchaser, or Facebook at There May Be Cupcakes. Please join my subreddit. I'm having fun adding relevant things to it. Or you can check out my lovely sponsors in the show or in the show notes, especially Care of. I just took my supplements, actually, before recording, and I've been doing so for years. I can't express how much I love this company and how flexible and customizable my plan is. And it costs so much less than buying supplements and vitamins separately from the store in bottles. Thank you for listening all these years and being my cupcakes that I can find anytime. I love you guys. Stay safe. If someone in your life feels unsafe to you, trust your instincts.
I want to say to my babies that your mama loves you so much, and your daddy, this whole family's love you so much, and you guys have got to be strong, because you are, I just know, I just feel in my heart that you're okay, but you got to take care of each other, and your mom and daddy are going to be right here waiting on you when you get home.
Susan took my babies from me twice. Once when she murdered them, and once when she lied about it.
Hi, this is Carla, and welcome to There Might Be Cupcakes, episode 21, 9 Days and 2 Car Seats. A caveat for this episode. I will be discussing Susan Smith's murder of her sons, Alex and Michael, and the racism involved in her accusation of a false perpetrator. I will not be delving explicitly into the forensic details of what happened to the boys, but I will be honest about what occurred, and I will be frankly discussing the racism issues involved from an academic and social standpoint, the social being mine, because I was a local and I lived this harrowing experience. This episode might not be for you, because I know filicide, infanticide, and racism are not topics for everyone. But I promise, as always, to be a sensitive and faithful storyteller, and to never take you somewhere I cannot lead you home from. Susan's infamous crying without tears speech to the media at the beginning is as fraught as we will get. You will hear other voices along with mine for the first time. I thought, since men were so important to Susan's life, that I shouldn't do all the voices this time. So I reined in 3 podcasting friends to play David Smith, her estranged husband, whom you heard at the beginning, Sheriff Howard Wells, whom you will hear in a moment, and the man that Susan desperately wanted to be her boyfriend, Tom Finley. I will introduce these friends and their wonderful podcast at the end of this episode, and I will link to their podcast on the Facebook page, in the Facebook group, and in this episode's entry on the website, theremightbecupcakes.com. So, are you ready? Take my hand. We can do this. It's the darkest of dark fairy tales, the original kind, with no happily ever after, the kind with dark woods and darker water and darkest schemes. It's the beginning of Hansel and Gretel, as I read to you last episode, only the father was away at work when the mother came up with her diabolical plan. On October 25th, 1994, just after 9 p.m., David Smith, a 24-year-old living in the small town of Union, South Carolina, received a page over the intercom at work, the Winn-Dixie grocery store. He had a phone call. His life was forever altered. Before that phone call, his life had been fatherhood of 2 young boys, soon-to-be ex-wife drama, girlfriend drama, small-town drama. After he picked up the receiver just outside the store manager's office, he became the center of a storm of controversy and pain and loss and fear and racism. On the phone was his estranged wife, 23-year-old Susan Vaughn Smith, and she was wailing that he's got the kids. David couldn't get any more than that out of her. A stranger took the phone and tried to explain further, but then she began to cry. Then Sheriff Howard Wells took the phone from her and stated,
"We're out here at the McLeod's house on Route 49. Your wife has informed us that she was carjacked at the Monarch Mill traffic light. The perpetrator left the scene with the car. The children were in it. Your wife is okay, but at this time the kids are still missing. Mr. Smith, I think you should come out here. Do you know where John D. Long Lake is? The McLeod place is up the hill off the highway. The house on the right, just before the turnoff to the lake."
When David arrived at the McLeod place, Sheriff Wells explained Susan's story. And it was this. She had been stopped at the traffic light when a black man opened the passenger door of her car and jumped in, forcing her to drive about 10 miles into the countryside along Route 49. Then he forced her to stop the car in the middle of the road and get out, and he slid into the driver's seat, refusing to let her retrieve the boys. He said he didn't have time to let her do that, but that he wouldn't hurt them. And then he drove away with 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex. For the next 9 days, our entire area of southern North Carolina and South Carolina was paralyzed. Everyone had one eye looking out for an African-American carjacker, the other looking for 2 toddlers whose photos were everywhere. Then on November 3rd, 9 days later, Susan confessed that it had all been a lie, with the regionally infamous phrase, "My children are not all right." She confessed to Sheriff Wells that the car had been underwater the entire time, 60 feet out and 18 feet deep in John D. Long Lake, within view of the front porch of the McLeod place.
Like a lot of other people, we watched the story of our boys' disappearance unfold on TV. It was an odd sensation hearing the people you knew and loved most referred to like strangers.
Susan Smith had been in love, you see, or infatuated, or obsessed, or in lust. Whichever combination of the above, she wanted to be with Tom Finley, the son of her boss. Tom was the most eligible bachelor in town, and the richest. But she was also obsessed with what her estranged husband and his girlfriend were up to. She didn't want David, but she didn't want anyone else to have David either. And she was also acting out sexually with other fellow employees in Finley's own home in his own hot tub, and in Hickory Nuts, Union, South Carolina's new and only bar. On October 17th, 7 days before that phone call to Winn-Dixie, Tom Finley had sat down on a computer at his father's business, or in the family mansion, and typed out a Dear Jane letter to Susan. In part, it read,
"You will, without a doubt, make some lucky man a great wife. But unfortunately, it won't be me. Susan, I could really fall for you. You have some endearing qualities about you, and I think that you are a terrific person. But like I've told you before, there are some things about you that aren't suited for me, and yes, I'm speaking about your children. If you want to catch a nice guy like me one day, you have to act like a nice girl."
There are some things about you that aren't suited for me, and yes, I am speaking about your children. And 1 week later, Susan Smith let her car drive into John D. Long Lake with Michael and Alex Smith, her sons, strapped and trapped in their car seat. The three major elements of this crime are filicide, the killing of one's own children, carjacking, which did not actually occur, and a racial hoax. For more discussion about filicide, I refer you back to Episode 2, Casey Anthony and Bonnie McNamara, and Episode 8, Toxic Doxology, both in which I explored the phenomenon and read some of my own fiction inspired by the Casey Anthony case. Carjacking is a portmanteau of car and hijacking, created by E.J. Mitchell, editor of the Detroit News in 1991, when he reported the murder of Ruth Wall, a 22-year-old Detroit native who would not relinquish her car to thieves. The term then started to be used by Detroit Police Dispatch and police officers to describe what they have been awkwardly referring to as robbery armed, unlawful driving away on an automobile, aka RAU-DA. Common methods used by carjackers are bumping the victim's vehicle, then driving away with it when the victim responds to the wreck by getting out to exchange insurance information, staging an accident, and then driving away with the victim's vehicle when the Good Samaritan stops to assist, communicating in some way, like flashing headlights, that there's something wrong with the victim's car, and stealing it when they pull over in response, and following the victim home with a co-conspirator, blocking the victim's driveway, then stealing their vehicle. The last on the list nearly happened to me, I think, around the time of Alex and Michael's murder. I left my home in Charlotte to head back to college in Raleigh. I had very little gas, so I stopped relatively quickly at a small gas station. Almost immediately, an older purple Honda Prelude pulled up in front of my car, blocking me from that direction, and it was full of guys. They all started hollering at me. I instantly felt threatened, so I got back in the car and awkwardly backed out from the pump and just kept driving towards school. They followed me and drove up beside me, continuing to yell and honking the horn. My gas tank kept getting lower, and they weren't giving up, and I wasn't coming upon a gas station that wasn't a small southern mom-and-pop operation. I wanted a large operation with lights and locks and a panic button. I also was not seeing any police cars. I finally realized that my only choice was to turn around and go home. They followed me all the way, honking and yelling. When I got home, they pulled in behind me sideways, blocking the driveway's exit. As soon as I hit the bottom of the driveway, I leaned on my horn and did not release it. The garage door opened to reveal my dad holding his baseball bat. Only then did the yelling and honking cease, and did they pull away. Thanks, Daddy. The racial hoax that Susan Smith perpetrated damaged our regional area for a long time, and the damage probably lingers still in generational damage. The term racial hoax was coined by Catherine Russell Brown, author of The Color of Crime, who defined it as when someone fabricates a crime and blames it on another person because of their race, or when an actual crime has been committed and the perpetrator falsely blames someone else because of their race. According to Russell Brown, a racial hoax can be performed by a person of any race against a person of any other race. However, racial hoaxes against African Americans are most likely to garner heavy media coverage and to do social and economic damage because of the stereotype of the violent criminal black man. Susan Smith, as a resident of a small town in South Carolina in 1994, knew that stereotype very, very well. I believe that her stating that her carjacker was a black man was calculated, and she had time to calculate this story. How do I know this? Because the police searched John D. Long Lake twice during those 9 days, but they only searched 30 feet out from shore, using normal calculations of how far a car might go if wrecked off the boat ramp. When Susan confessed on day 9, she told them exactly where her maroon Mazda protege had sunk. It had floated at first, you see, unexpectedly bobbing towards the lake's man-made dam before sinking. It was 60 feet out, and she knew where it had gone down, so precisely that they found it on the first dive. The only way she could have known that is if she had watched it float, travel, bob, flip, and sink upside down. She had all that time, while watching, and possibly listening to her boys cry for her, to calculate her story and choose her boogeyman. And the best boogeyman in 1990's Union, South Carolina, was an anonymous, violent, criminal black man.
Even that first day, before things got real crazy, I could tell Susan had the sense she was on a stage. I thought she might be playing up the drama a little bit, but I had no idea how much.
How small was Union, South Carolina? Sheriff Wells was friends with Scotty Vaughn, Susan's brother, and lived down the street from Susan's mother and stepfather. Sheriff Wells and his wife were godparents to Scotty's 2 children. The Winn-Dixie grocery store was the town's social hub. It and its parking lot were a place to hang out and meet up. Many of the town's residents either worked there at the time or had worked there previously. There was no movie theater in Union. When David and Susan were dating, they had to drive 25 miles outside the city limits of Union to Spartanburg, South Carolina, to go to the movies. Susan and Tiffany, David's girlfriend, now wife, knew each other in high school and were in the Junior Civitans Club together. Susan, the current president and senior, spoke up then for Tiffany's leadership skills as a freshman. Thanks to Susan, as a sophomore, Tiffany became secretary-treasurer. And most small town of all, the Union Salvation Army fed all of the local, regional, and national press corps that showed up.
It was like those news trucks were mushrooms sprouting from the ground after a hard rain.
It was also a small town detail that caught Susan in her lies. Remember, she said she had been stopped at the Monarch Mill stoplight when the man jumped into her car. Well, Sheriff Wells knew that that particular stoplight operated on a vehicle sensor. In the direction Susan had been supposedly driving, the stoplight was always green. It didn't have enough traffic. It was always green unless another car approached on the intersecting street. So either there was a phantom witness or she was lying. Small town traffic. I remember how very strange everything and everyone was during those 9 days, even across the border in metropolitan Charlotte. The social air was stiller somehow. Strangers stopped greeting each other. You didn't make small talk with cashiers. Everyone received side-eye from everyone, because someone had poisoned the village well in the worst way, either way. Either someone had stolen 2 innocent babies, both under 3 years old, from their mama's arms, helpless and strapped into their car seats, and had done so feeding into racial fears. Or the most gruesome of fairy tales had come to life, and a mama that we all might have run into at Myrtle Beach, or in Spartanburg, or at Fort Sumter, had killed her own flesh and blood for what? A boyfriend who didn't want kids? Revenge against her husband? Or the worst, most frightening reason that she gave to Sheriff Wells, then to her husband David when he visited her in jail? No reason that she could think of. No reason at all. Halloween that year was suffocated under a bell jar. It fell on day 6. We had almost no trick-or-treaters, and we lived in an upperly mobile, insulated suburban development, miles away from Union, where people could pretend it wasn't happening. The air felt stilled and eerie and uncomfortable, thick and tinged like we were collectively holding our breath. And in a sense we were. As I said, Susan claimed that she did it for no reason that she could name. That's true. Her defense claimed dependent personality disorder, major depression, sexual abuse by her stepfather that developed to ongoing sexual contact into adulthood, And that infamous letter from Tom, her love Tom. She was hyper-focused on Tom during those 9 days. One of the first things she said to David, after he spoke to the sheriff then rushed to be by Susan's side, is that Tom might come see her, so don't get mad. He didn't. Tom called her once during those 9 days, and she made a huge production of it, announcing it to everyone present, shooing everyone out of a back bedroom for privacy. But he was just conveying thoughts and prayers. She also consistently wore Tom's alma mater sweatshirt, only removing it for the cameras. But when she confessed to the sheriff on that 9th day, and when she wrote a confession to David and then wrote out her official confession, there was no mention of Tom or of any motive at all. She even wrote, "I don't know why I did it." Both documents are chilling. They are written in fine, even penmanship, and they have hearts drawn on them. Hearts drawn on them. The person who wrote both documents was very calm, content even, and seemed to have no concept of the pain she had caused, or of everything that had led up to that letter and that official confession. She even wrote in both about concerns for herself. "I know my life is going to be hell from here on. Nobody gives a damn about me." That theme repeated itself when David finally visited her for the first time in jail. In response to David expressing his pain by saying, "I'll never be able to show my kids how to ride a bike. I'll never be able to get the chance to take them fishing or teach them how to play ball. You just rip them from me." Susan immediately replied, "I'm having a hard time too. Nobody cares about me down here. I'm in a little bitty cell. I don't get to go out but just an hour a day." That was her immediate response. The eeriest thing she said to David during that meeting, and the thing that ended the meeting, was this: "David, when I get out, if I get out of here, I hope that maybe we can get together and have more kids." There were other strange behaviors that showed immediately. Susan, on that first night, was wailing in front of Sheriff Wells and the McLeod family. When she got into the car to go to her family's house to stay with David, she immediately calmed down. She then stated that she wanted to go first to David and Susan's house to get her contact lenses. It was now approximately 11 p.m. She was going to be interrogated by the police at her parents' house. She had just been allegedly carjacked and her children kidnapped. But nobody needs to be seeing her in her eyeglasses? This is also when she told David that Tom Finley would probably be checking on her and David couldn't fuss about it. When they entered their home, David was nearly floored by the presence of the boys' lives. Their toys, their sippy cups, the evidence of their dinner from that night. Susan, however, walked right past all their belongings and did not react at all. One thing I remember really striking me as a local is watching her on the news and recognizing that the crying voice did not have any liquid tears to go along with it. I want to play it again here now so that you can listen to it knowing all about the case and now knowing Susan.
I want to say to my babies that your mama loves you so much, and your daddy, this whole family's love you so much. And you guys have got to be strong, because you are, I just know, I just feel in my heart that you're okay, but you got to take care of each other. And your mom and daddy are going to be right here waiting on you when you get home.
But the most striking thing above all as a local and as a person was my great-grandfather. I told stories about this wonderful man in episode 9, Family Trees. Grandpa Porter never wished harm on anyone, and actually went out of his way, to his own detriment, to help complete strangers. I never even heard him say a cross word, except once or twice in jest, until October 25th, 1994. Grandpa was transfixed by the news, as was almost everyone. He would just silently watch from his rocking chair, staring daggers at Susan, as she was "please" over and over in her cry voice. Then every once in a while he would mutter, "They need to do exactly to her what she did to them boys." Or, "They need to strap her into the car and drive her into the water. That's the only fitting punishment." And those were the only things he would say about it. He would brook no discussion. He would pinch his kind lips together and shake his head if you tried to talk about the case. Nothing but, "They need to put her in the lake," and then squash it. One time when he did that and then left the room, Grandma Porter turned to me and said, Your grandpa said that he would have taken in those boys if she didn't want them." What Susan Smith did to Michael and Alex Smith broke something in my great-grandfather's heart irrevocably. As a local, I cannot talk about this case without discussing the prosecutor, Tommy Pope. He was an elected official, and by the time the case went to trial in 1995, Union, South Carolina support was actually turning towards Susan. I know, shocking to me too. But she was a hometown girl. Her stepfather was kind of a big deal. Her family was friends with the sheriff. David's family was not such a big deal, and were initially from Michigan. The Old South was still alive and well, and is today. There were unspoken racist reasons for supporting Susan as a pitiful victim as well, but they mostly remained in whispers. People that wanted to support her bought into the defense story that she actually was so miserable in her marriage and devastated by the Dear Jane letter that she had intended to commit suicide along with murdering the boys, but had somehow, chickened out? Forgot to get in the car? The gymnastics of rationalization are fascinating to me. So Mr. Pope knew he was swimming upstream, and he knew that pushing the death penalty against the pitiful hometown girl's suicide cry voice, poor baby, might cost him the next election. But he won my heart by getting on the news and telling the world that he was going to prosecute Susan Smith as if he were not an elected official, that he was going to focus on the case and only on the case. Then, her attorney approached him with a request. "Can we show pictures of Susan with her boys in court, playing with them and loving on them, during the trial?" Without missing a beat, Mr. Pope whipped out the autopsy photos of Michael and Alex after they'd been in their car seats for 9 days underwater, thrust them in the attorney's face, and said, "Absolutely. If I get to show my pictures. You want to see pictures? Here's some pictures." The defense attorney withdrew his motion without further comment. The prosecutorial move that cut past all the defense strategies. The Susan was sexually abused, her parents divorced, and the suicide of her father. The defense psychiatrist's diagnosis of Susan as having major depression as comorbid with dependent personality disorder, and won the murder case, was all Tommy Pope's idea. He obtained a similar car to Susan's maroon Mazda Protege. He put a video camera in the back seat at approximately Michael, the older child's viewpoint, and drove the car off the boat ramp into John D. Long Lake. He then had the jury, judge, and courtroom watch the entire tape from the drive down the boat ramp until the car settled onto the bottom of the lake, 18 feet down. So, where and how is Susan now? She confessed November 3rd, 1994, on the 9th day, by saying to the sheriff the regionally infamous words, "My children are not all right." 8 months later, she was convicted on July 22nd, 1995, of 2 counts of first-degree murder, the murder of Michael Daniel Smith and Alexander Tyler Smith. 6 days later, on July 28th, 1995, she was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 30 years. Her first eligibility will be in 2024, when she and I will be 53 years old. That's right, we're peers. It's an accident of geography that we didn't go to the same high school. We were in the Junior Civitans and the National Honor Society at the same time. I was able to access her incarceration reports, and they paint a fascinating picture. She has had 50 changes of work detail position since September 26, 1995, and many of them are marked inmate request. That's 50 job changes in 22 years. There were 6 disciplinary actions on the report I saw. 3 were for drug possession. 1 was for using another inmate's pen I assumed to access their commissary account, so it was for stealing. And one was for self-mutilation. She cut herself with a smuggled razor. One was sexual. She had sex with 2 male prison guards, both of whom were also disciplined. It came out afterwards that strict instructions had to be left in her file by the warden that she was never to be left unattended with male guards. She is currently at this time doing landscaping work, which is a work detail she has been repeatedly asked to be moved out of over the years. And Miss National Honor Society, in 22 years of incarceration, has not earned 1 academic credit for anything. I find that most striking of all. I told you I would bring you back into the light, where there might be cupcakes, and here they are. Today, David Smith, Michael and Alex's father, is doing well. He is married to his girlfriend of that time, Tiffany, and they have 2 beautiful children. The season of autumn, and especially Halloween, are still extremely difficult for him, but he allows himself to grieve when he needs to, and because his partner was there through it all, he has the best support possible. This episode is dedicated to Mike, and Alex, Fat Rat, Smith. I would like to thank, as always, my sponsor, Audible, the best audiobook store available. If you follow my sponsor link, audibletrial.com/mightbecupcake, that's one word, Audible Trial, and sign up for a 30-day free membership trial, you not only receive that chance to check out all the wonderful benefits of membership, I love it, I've been a member forever, but you get a free book of your choice to keep, even if you choose not to become a member. Because this episode was so intense, my suggestion for a free book to keep this week is A Cheerful Palate Cleanser, Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery, narrated by the sweet voice actress Rachel McAdams from Mean Girls. 9 hours and 22 minutes of gumption and Anne with an E. I would also love to thank my voices. I truly appreciate my podcasting friends for playing Sheriff Howard Wells, David Smith, and Tom Finley for me. Usually I read straight through, but I felt that with 2 eyewitnesses and 1 very important Dear Jane letter that my usual doing all the voices wouldn't cut it. Sheriff Wells was played by Jeff Richardson. Jeff hosts not 1 but 2 really cool podcasts, and I'm going to read exactly what he sent to me. Howdy, I'm Jeff Richardson. I'm one of the co-hosts of a great podcast called Everything is Awesome with Jeff and Casey. Casey and I love storytelling and true crime podcasts, so it's really cool that I get to do one of these characters. I remember the Susan Smith case. That shit was crazy. That pretty much sums it up. I was a senior in high school, and I knew instantly something wasn't right about that story. P.S. I also host a side podcast called Shattered Worlds RPG. You can find us on Facebook or any of the Google or podcasting apps. We're a fun group of dorks playing a role-playing game that I created called Shattered Worlds. Thanks again to Carla for doing this show and making our lives a little bit brighter. Aw, thank you. Look, a cupcake. David Smith, Susan's husband, and more importantly, Michael and Alex's dad, was played by Chris Iazzi. I hope I pronounced that right, Chris. I'm so sorry. Who hosts the CNJ Gamecast along with Nick and Jamie. They cover classic and modern video game news and game collecting. A recent episode that I'm interested in and I've already queued up is all about Sega. Team Sonic the Hedgehog. Tom Finley, the erstwhile love interest of Susan Smith's, was played by Nick Alexander, who hosts the Brohio podcast. The Bros, Nick and Rob, who have been friends since the 6th grade, which is so cool, covered the things that go bump in the night. The paranormal, true crime, cryptozoology, aliens, conspiracy theories, and urban legends. And as they say, they try to put a comic spin on everything as best they can. Their latest episodes covered the Indiana Hell House, the Salem Witch Trials, which is a pet topic of mine, and alien abductions. Thank you, my listeners, for trusting me to tell this difficult story. And thank you again to my voices. Until next week, be extra kind to each other, especially to strangers. You never know, as we've learned from this episode, what other people are going through.
And a surprise kindness cupcake might actually make all the difference.
Mr. Smith, I think you should come out here. Do you know where John D. Long Lake is? The McLeod place is up the hill off the highway. The house on the right, just before the turnoff to the lake.
I'm playing the part of sheriff. My name's Jeff. I share the part of